Are you watching the ACC? Hey, welcome into the Voice of College Football. We appreciate you stopping by for the best discussion, debate, and analysis of college football anywhere based on your participation. Please hit the like button and subscribe. We are checking out the TV ratings. It was a raving success last offseason. You guys soaked it up, and we appreciate delivering the numbers and putting them into context. More importantly, we have knocked out the Big 12. Please check out that video. We're on to the ACC, and this breakdown is a little bit more complicated than it was last year because everybody stayed in the same conference from year to year other than the additions from the group of 5 to the Big 12. But this season, we've got 4 additions to the Big 10. We've got 2 to the SEC via the Big 12 and, of course, the demise of the Pac-12. So we are projecting and taking the numbers as they would look in 2024 based on 2023. So the teams that are coming into the ACC, Stanford, SMU, and Cal included in these ratings. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect because consider that Stanford, Cal, and SMU playing different matchups in the ACC will provide different outcomes in terms of eyeballs paying attention to those games. Also, at the conclusion of this series, when we go through the various conference matchups, we're going to size up the TV windows because that is key, and also what networks these games are played on. Again, check out the Big 12. The Big 10 and the SEC are coming up next. Let's start with week 1 in the ACC. Florida State, LSU. Huge TV numbers, but we've got to consider as well that there was no competition for this game. For the second straight season, these two teams played all alone by themselves on Monday night, Labor Day weekend, so no competition there. The same with Clemson and Duke. That game was all by itself on Sunday night. So no competition there, so that's got to be taken into consideration, but 2 really good numbers for the top of the ACC. North Carolina, South Carolina was the 7th highest rated game of week 1 at 3.4 million, and on down the line, Tennessee blew out Virginia, so not much of a game to watch, but still 2.5 million people checked out the Cavaliers and the Vols. Louisville and Georgia Tech was a really good game, and a conference game at 1.65 million right there. And there we see SMU, of course, not in the ACC last year, taking on Louisiana Tech as the 36th rated game of the week out of 36 games at 72,000 people. So just a smattering of you checking out the Mustangs and the Bulldogs. Now in week 2 out of 28 games on the TV ratings, the Miami win over Texas A&M at Hard Rock was the 3rd highest ranked game in terms of TV numbers at 4+ million. Notre Dame, North Carolina State came in strong at just under 3 million at number 6 on the week. And Auburn and Cal, again, Cal in the Pac-12 and Stanford out of the Pac-12, but going into the ACC, pulled good numbers in week 2, but you got to think that those are mostly attributed to playing an SEC team in Auburn and playing one of the big brands in college football, USC, against Stanford. Cincinnati, Pitt, of course, Pitt was down at 3-9, but at this point in only week 2, it appeared as though Pitt would have a pretty good football team, and all these games were woefully under 1 million views in week 2. Moving on to week 3, Florida State given a scare by Boston College, and people hung around to watch that one. Out of 30 games ranked in the TV ratings in week 3, that was the 5th highest ranked game at 3.5 million viewers. Pitt, West Virginia, kind of a dull 17-6 game, but 2.5 million checked out the Backyard Brawl, one of the great games in college football. Minnesota, North Carolina at 1.5 million, and on down the line, one other game involving an ACC team ranked above 1 million views at number 12 for the week as Syracuse defeated Purdue by 15 points, and then you see a number of ACC doormats placing under 1 million views. Virginia Tech and Rutgers at 360,000 viewers. On to week 4 in the highest rated game the entire ACC season among conference teams, and it was a great game. It went to overtime in Death Valley as Florida State defeated Clemson, and 6.7 million people watched the game. 32 games rated in week 4. And the ACC had that number 3 spot, also 2 in the top 12, 3 in the top 17, with 3 games over 1 million because the ACC didn't fare too well in this particular week, aside from that colossal Florida State win over Clemson, North Carolina State, Virginia at 1.5 million views. Miami and Temple, blowout. Georgia Tech, Wake Forest, a couple middling teams at about 330,000. And again, we are also including the teams coming into the ACC, which includes SMU and TCU at 269,000 folks. Moving on to week 5, only 18 games rated this particular week. Notre Dame and Duke played an excellent game. Duke left Notre Dame off the hook on a fourth down conversion late in the game, and 5+ million people watched it. It was the third highest rated game of the week. Clemson, Syracuse at just under 2 million, as well as Louisville and North Carolina State at just under 2 million. SMU and Charlotte, my goodness, that might be the lowest watched game of any FBS game the entire year at just 18,000 people watching Charlotte and SMU. On to week 6, and while a lot of ACC fans are disgruntled about Notre Dame not being technically and formally in the conference, not competing for a championship, but just playing 5 or 6 ACC games a year, well, this is one of the big reasons why. When Notre Dame shows up, viewers show up. Notre Dame Louisville on Saturday night at Louisville drew over 5 million viewers. Virginia Tech, Florida State at over 3 million. And Syracuse, North Carolina, almost at 1 million viewers, despite North Carolina just drubbing Syracuse. So not many people probably stuck around to watch that entire game at 41-3, as the ACC had 2 of the top 7 games, 3 of the top 13, and number 18 with NC State taking on Marshall. Miami, North Carolina was the 7th highest rated game for week 7 out of 35 games. Syracuse, Florida State at over 2 million views, so the ACC had 2 of the top 11 games this particular week, 3 of the top 20, 4 of the top 25, again, 35 ranked, and it was pretty slim pickings for the ACC in this particular week. Moving on to week 8, Duke and Florida State, entertaining game with Duke leading in the third quarter before Riley Leonard got hurt, and of course at this point in the season, it's getting late, and Florida State was undefeated and starting to draw some views. Over 4 million for the Noles and the Blue Devils. UCLA Stanford, of course, a Pac-12 game, but Stanford moving to the ACC drew almost 1 million views. And Virginia, North Carolina, that was a massive upset. And I'm sure out of those 788,000 that tuned in for this one, many of them tuned into the fourth quarter as the Cavaliers pulled off one of the biggest upsets of 2023. Week 9 saw 33 games in the TV ratings, including Florida State and Wake Forest at number 9. So the ACC did not have any of the top 8 rated games in Week 9. So a sparsely viewed week for the conference. Just 2 million people watched Florida State and Wake. Pitt Notre Dame was a complete annihilation. Usually it would be a higher rated game, but Notre Dame had obviously at this point lost 2 or 3 games, and Pitt was a dismal team. So under 2 million watched the Panthers and the Irish. Duke Louisville at just under 1 million views and on down the line. And picking up the rear, of course, again, is SMU and Tulsa. And of course, SMU, coming out of a group of 5, is going to have the lowest TV numbers. It'll be interesting to see if SMU can pick it up a bit in taking on some ACC teams, but only 33,000 people watched SMU and Tulsa. On to week 10, and Notre Dame Clemson drew over 3.2 million views. Florida State and Pitt at 1.7 million as the Panthers made it a fairly close game to keep some people interested. Boston College and Syracuse, the only other ACC game over 1 million views, as the ACC had the 6th, 12th, and 16th rated games of the week. Wake and Duke at number 18 at 814,000 views. And there's poor SMU again against Rice at 29,000 viewers. Miami, Florida State, of course, topped the ACC ratings in Week 11. It was the 4th highest rated college football game for Week 11 out of 37 at 4+ million people watching. Georgia Tech Clemson was at 1.6 million. Virginia and Louisville was a really good Friday night game in which the Cavaliers almost pulled off the upset and over 1 million people watched it. As we move on to Week 12, 34 games in the rankings. Louisville-Miami was an entertaining game, and at this point of the season, Louisville gunning for an ACC Championship Game bid. Also on the fringe of the college football playoff discussion. This game went right down to the wire in a goal line stand, and Louisville-Miami was almost at 3 million views. North Carolina Clemson at 1.7. Wake and Notre Dame a blowout at under 1.5 million views. And again, we got to check in on SMU, but with Memphis as being the foe, on a better network, better time. And again, we will get to those later in our series. 276,000 people watched SMU in Memphis. Of course, week 13 is Thanksgiving weekend and the last regular season weekend of college football, and also the weekend in which the ACC has 4 big matchups with the SEC: Georgia, Georgia Tech, Florida, Florida State, Louisville, Kentucky, and South Carolina, Clemson. And there you see the matchups right there. Georgia, Georgia Tech, over 5 million viewers. Florida, Florida State, over 5 million viewers. Both games weren't classics, weren't down to the wire, but were competitive, good ball games. Cal defeated UCLA, and again, we'll have to see how the Cal and Stanford conversion to the ACC plays out. Kentucky-Louisville was a noon game up against Ohio State-Michigan, the colossal matchup that drew almost 20 million viewers. So that is going to take a hit at 1.57 million. Miami-Boston College, that was a noon game, but on Friday. And there you see Navy and SMU pulling up the rear at 76,000, the 36th ranked game out of 40 on the final weekend of the season. There you see the ACC Championship Game with Louisville taking on Florida State. Kind of a dull, low-scoring game, but Florida State, after a close game through much of the way, scored late to widen the gap to 16-6. And, of course, a playoff spot we thought was on the line, so that probably kept some viewers around, but still lagged behind at the SEC and a pretty bad Big Ten Championship Game at 26-0, although people do watch the Big Ten Championship Game. Let's check out the top 10 games in the ACC for 2023. These are all conference games. So Florida State Clemson, over 6 million, almost 7 million people watched it. Clemson Duke would be number 2. And Miami Florida State is the next one at 4.1 million. Again, keep in mind that the Clemson Duke game had no competition. Nobody else was playing. You see a lot of Florida State in the top 5 or 6 against Duke. Also against Boston College at 3.5 million, and on down the line, you see a lot of Florida State, you see some Miami, and then some other matchups involving Louisville and NC State, bringing up the top 10 at 1.89 million. And again, folks, check out the Big 12 video, and the Big 10 and the SEC are coming up, and also the networks are very important to all this, and we will tie that in a future video. But let's check out the milestones for the ACC, make the comparison back to the Big 12, and we're going to make those comparisons coming up. So the ACC had 34 conference games, so we're tossing out the likes of Florida State and LSU, for example, and the matchups against the SEC. These are only conference games, and the ACC had the one big matchup. Florida State-Clemson was the highest viewed game, and then we also had 3 other matchups that had over 4 million views, and then 7 with over 3 million, 9 with over 2 million, and then 20 of the 34 conference games with at least 1 million views. People watch the ACC in pretty good numbers. It doesn't compare to the SEC or the Big Ten, and we will see those numbers and that comparison here shortly. But for one example, if you look at the top 10 matchups for the Big 12 last season in terms of TV ratings, those games in total drew 22.8 million viewers. That's just under 2.3 million per game. For the ACC, that number is 35 million. 35 million, 22.8 million. So good showing for the ACC in comparison to the Big 12. They're not going to get much of a bump from Stanford and Cal or SMU. Maybe on down the line, if the ACC is able to hold it together, if those teams get better, there will be some kind of a bump, but not much of anything there. The ACC obviously trying to reinforce itself by adding numbers to the conference and 17 teams competing in 2024. Your thoughts down below, your questions, your comments, everything you got for us as we continue this series. Please share the videos out on social media. Subscribe right here at the Voice of College Football.